The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, the classic Christian allegory, in a book which is, for Protestantism at least, probably the second most influential behind only the Bible itself. So, fun fact about me, if you did not know, until the age of 9, I believe, I actually attended a religious school, a Christian school. That's right, while all you heathens out there were imperiling your immortal souls by learning satanic doctrines such as the Big Bang Theory or evolution, I was learning the Word. And I also had to read this, The Pilgrim's Progress. Well, not this version exactly, but rather a kind of dumbed down, more child friendly version of The Pilgrim's Progress. Now, those of you who were not brought up with a religious education may be familiar with this work if you have seen the music video for the Danzig song Mother, which opens with a quote from The Pilgrim's Progress. Then I saw that there was a way to hell even from the gates of heaven as well as from the city of destruction. So this book has had quite the influence since its publication, both within and without, to an extent, the religious community. So John Bunyan, if you did not know, was a Puritan minister in like 1600s England who was arrested and imprisoned for preaching without a license. Yes, that was actually an offense that you could get arrested for back then because the Church of England was like the established religious institution and they really cracked down hard on those who did not conform. And John Bunyan was such a one. Again, he was arrested for preaching without a license and imprisoned, and he did quite the bid in prison. I think he served like 12 years in prison. And I believe that he wrote The Pilgrim's Progress in prison, or that was at least the genesis of The Pilgrim's Progress. And The Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory, as I said. And when I say allegory, I mean allegory in the most blunt and least subtle way possible. This is not a book that you will have to puzzle over or parse the meaning from. Oh no. What it wants you to know, it makes very, very, very abundantly clear. This is also one of the first novels ever written. That's right. This is right up there with like Don Quixote and Robinson Crusoe as being on the ground floor of modern novels. And this is both a hybrid kind of work of literature, but also a kind of dogmatic means for religious instruction. So, what is the story of The Pilgrim's Progress? What is the book actually about? Well, it is divided into two parts. The first part being what most people are probably more familiar with. And the first part concerns a man named Christian. That's right. I said it's not subtle, it's very blunt. And I meant that. Our protagonist's name is Christian. And he lives in the city of destruction, which is a stand in for the mortal world, Earth, basically. And then one day, after reading from the Bible, he realizes that he is destined for damnation unless he gets right with the big man JC and gets the burden of sin off his back. And in the book, he literally has like a burden, like some kind of like baggage on his back that he has to get off. So he tells his wife and kids that he something has to change. He has to do something, but they're like, "Nah, you're crazy. You're tripping." So then he's like, "Well, screw you then. I'm trying to get my ass to heaven." And heaven in this book is represented as the celestial city, which is a distant location, which the pilgrims have to reach in order to attain salvation, to gain admittance into the pearly gates. So Christian throws up the deuces, and then he's like, I'm going to make my way to the celestial city. So he sets out, and then the book is just his travels on the road to redemption, so to speak. And he encounters various characters who are very bluntly named, such as ignorance, talkative, obstinate, pliable, He's even helped at one point by a man named Help. Again, there is no subtlety whatsoever in this book. It is so blunt, so direct. Um, there is kind of some kind of charm to it, I guess. But anyway, so Christian journeys uh, down the road to trying to get to the celestial city, and this forms what the book really is, which is a dramatization of the navigation through the mortal, fallen world by the Christian believer. And eventually, Christian makes it to the celestial city, which is surrounded by a river, which represents death, and then he fords the river and drowns. But then he gets to go to the other side, and live happily ever after in eternity. That's part one, and now we come to part two, which is highly redundant. But part two is the story of Christian's wife and children, his wife being named Christiana, as they finally wake up to the fact that they also are destined for damnation and set out along the same road trying to gain salvation just as Christian did and make it to the celestial city. That's right, this book literally tells the same story twice, basically. Um, and yeah, the second part is not only is it just completely redundant because it really is just the same story told twice. They go down the same road, they encounter the same travails and perils, basically. But the second part is also kind of. I did not like the second part as much as the first because even as heavy handed as part one was, you can kind of respect it even if you may not be of the same persuasion as the book is. But then the second part is more concerned about, or nominally at least, uh, Christian's wife. There's kind of a gender split in this between part one, which is about Christian, and part two, which is about his wife. And so I was curious to see how John Bunyan was going to handle like the pilgrimage, the journey of the soul between like the male perspective and female perspective. And it's not as good. It really isn't, because what the message of the second part is that basically, if you're a woman, you got to have someone to fight for you, basically. Because in part one, Christian like faces lots of trials and foes by himself, and he comes out victorious because of his resolute faith and devotion. But then in the second part, Christiana and her kids are guided the whole way by a man named Mr. Greatheart, who's like a knight or something with a sword, who fights all their battles for them because, of course, women are just too weak and feeble. So the second part is, I did not like the second part, not only because I can see that some people might find it kind of insulting in some ways, but also because it's just the same thing twice. It's literally the same story twice. Like part two, the way I can describe the Pilgrim's Progress is that part two is basically what the Force Awakens is to part one's A New Hope. That is to say, a shittier and much less charming rendition of what is, in essence, the same exact story. But so that is the plot of The Pilgrim's Progress. It is, again, a dramatization of the Christian believer journeying through the fallen world of sin, trying to reach heaven or the celestial city. So now let's talk about the technical aspects of it. Let's start with the writing. The Pilgrim's Progress is, if I'm being generous, it is written in a very, very unique fashion, I'll say. And part of me kind of is inclined to cut it a little slack because, this is an old ass book. It's from the 1600s. I mean, things were written differently back then. Part of me wants to cut it some slack and kind of just say that whatever issues that I had with the writing may have been due to its archaic nature. But I don't think that's fully the case. In fact, I think John Bunyan was basically just throwing all rules of writing to the wind. I mean, it reads very, very uniquely once again. So there are no quotation marks. As a major fan of Cormac McCarthy myself, that wasn't a hurdle to me, but it might be to some people. There are no quotation marks, but beyond that, we just have random sections that are in italics. It just alternates between regular font and italics for seemingly no reason. Sometimes just like mid paragraph, mid sentence almost, it'll just switch. Also, the tenses in this are just confused as all hell. It's told primarily in past tense, but then some lines are just in present tense. Don't know why. But also, the weirdest thing I think is that um, it's written parts like parts of it are written or halfway written at least like a play where it will have like the character's name with a period and then words after them which represents their dialogue, but then after having that it will still have the dialogue tags, like it will say Christian period, then have some dialogue, and then at the end of the dialogue it will say thus said Christian. I'm like, what is the point of putting the name first with the period and then still having the dialogue tag at the end? It makes no freaking sense. And then also the second part is written, I would say, much worse than the first part. You know, second verse worse than the first, so to speak. The second part, he like the characters will use the word was, like we was going down the road. It's almost like that. It's almost like that line. If you've ever seen that movie with Will Ferrell, The Campaign, where he says schools is the most important thing in America. You know, it's almost like that. We was going down the road, and then it's like I were going over here. It's very strange. Again, the tenses are all out of whack. And then there's even one part in the second part of the book where the character of Mr. Greatheart is relating a tale. He's relating the story of another pilgrim he encountered. But then he just, like John Bunyan, just forgets like halfway through that section that Mr. Greatheart is telling the story, and so then it like references he references himself in third person basically uh, during the recounting of this story, and it's just like there was no editing at all going into this book, I don't think. And also, I don't know if John Bunyan just was not familiar with the rules of writing or if he was just doing his own thing, because this thing reads like nothing I've ever read before. It is truly kind of a thing unto itself in that regard. So the writing is, it's definitely unconventional, if not just kind of flat out bad, at times, certainly at least. But anyway, let's move on to the characters. So there is no character development in this at all, except for the barest hint of character development in the second part of the book, namely embodied in the character of Mercy, who is a woman who is a friend of Christiana, Christian's wife, who decides to take up with her and go on this pilgrimage. There is a teensy little bit of character development with her where we see her wrestling with her own kind of weaknesses, but also is just kind of, she's like the one townsperson from the city of destruction who decides to go with Christiana. And yeah, there is just like the barest hint of some kind of character depth with her. But other than that, there's basically no character development at all with this, because that's not really what this book is about. I mean, it is technically a work of literature, but it's much more a document intended for religious instruction, and all the characters are just archetypal. You have obviously Christian, who is, you know, the typical Christian, and then you have like they have a character in here named Atheist, who embodies the typical atheist, or what John Bunyan took to be the typical atheist. Yeah, so not much to speak of in way of character depth or complexity. Ain't much of that. But the actual story once again, I guess I've already touched on it. It's very redundant. The first part, like I said, is what most people are familiar with because that really is the heart of the Pilgrim's Progress. If only because that was the first part of it. The second part is just completely redundant and it just tells the same story twice, in kind of in a much less likable way. If you even like the first part, so the story, it's well paced, I guess. I mean, it's not too long. It's definitely like no slowing down. It moves at a steady pace. Not really any slow portions to speak of. Christian is on the road to redemption, trying to make it to the celestial city, and he's just encountering one thing after another, one pitfall after another, which the believer has to skirt in order to make it to the end zone, so to speak. So, in terms of plotting, it's fine, I guess, except again, it just tells the same story twice. But yeah, so um, to rate The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, I will give The Pilgrim's Progress a C plus. I'm being probably a little bit generous with it. But it does have its charm. It really does, and it is certainly one of the most influential books ever written. And also, it was just one of the first novels written, so I will give it a little leeway at least. So yeah, C plus. It's not great, but it's also not terrible. I mean, it kind of has a kind of certain charm to it, um, if you can kind of get on its wavelength. But yeah, I think C plus is where I'm at with it. Now, have you read The Pilgrim's Progress? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it. If you have, or if you have agreed or disagreed with anything that I've said about it here today. And if you have not read The Pilgrim's Progress, um, I might could possibly recommend this, even though I'm not giving it the highest rating. I might possibly could recommend this because whether or not you're of the theological persuasion, which this book so obviously is, there is still some valuable stuff to be gotten from it, I think. It's very important in life to live while adhering to an ideal. There are no truer words out there that have ever been spoken than that old proverb that says, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And even if you don't believe like this book does, there's a lot of valuable stuff in here about staying the course, about standing by what you believe, standing by your convictions, and not being swayed by the world. And also, there's a lot of good stuff in here about delayed gratification and not just, trying to get your pleasures in the most immediate fashion, but living living in pursuit of something higher, something beyond, so to speak. And so, like I said, even if you're not Christian, even if you're not puritanically Christian, there is still valuable stuff to be gotten in this book. There is some very sound advice about life in here, about, like, as Paul says in the Bible, running the race, fighting the good fight, so to speak, and again, standing by what you believe and staying the course and making it to the end zone. So I think this is a valuable book. Again, even if you don't agree with it, even if you're not of that persuasion, there is still some good stuff to be gotten in here. As heavy-handed and blunt and artless as it is, still some valuable stuff. So I might could recommend this, at least the first part. The second part, maybe take it or leave it. But the first part, at least, I think it might be worth a read if you're curious, at least. But anyway, as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.